It's a real pleasure to welcome Michael McQueen to the Caring CEO podcast. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me. Great to spend some time chatting.
Michael, what does care in the workplace mean to you?
I guess in its simplest terms, I think care is creating an environment where people flourish, where people can be themselves, reach their potential, have not just their minds nourished, but essentially almost having their souls flourish in a work environment. I mean, that's the ideal, is that it's not just about minimizing harm or making sure people don't get hurt, but actually creating an environment where people can be their best selves. I think that's the ideal.
Yeah, it's really fascinating that my last interview was with a lady who was Pam Buchanan, was previously the managing director of NASDAQ. You can't
Uh-huh.
think of a more left mind sort of role.
Yep.
But it's interesting. She left that and she now talks about soul health. And
How
in
interesting.
yeah, and that really is about, our life force, our spirit, our uniqueness. But it's interesting she talked at something which seems so contrary to, being the managing director of as NASDAQ. You talk a lot about change and you're one of the 12 top futurists in the world. What do you think is having the biggest impact in our workplaces today?
So I hesitate because it's the most obvious answer. It's also in some ways the most boring answer because everyone's talking about it, and that is in the tech world, AI. And it's every industry, it is every role function. I think we are not really seeing the impact of AI fully yet. I was there speaking at an event at Parliament House a few months ago, and the head scientist, Australia's head scientist, was also speaking at this event. And something he said I thought was pretty accurate. He said 80% of what you're hearing right now in terms of AI is hype. And it really is. There's a lot of hype right now. But he said the remaining 20% is going to fundamentally change the way you live, the way you work, the way our society functions. And I think we're only just seeing the beginning stages of that. So even though there's a whole bunch of people like, oh yeah, AI, we've talked all about that. I'm like, yeah, well, we have, but we've also only just seen the beginning of it. So I think the impact
Mm.
of this in terms of certainly how we work, I read some great research from MIT. When was that? No, not sorry, not MIT, Harvard Business School it was. Ethan Mollick here. So any listeners who don't follow Ethan Mollick's work, highly recommend you just follow him on LinkedIn. He posts some really insightful stuff around the impact of AI in the workplace. He shared a study a couple of weeks ago they'd just done. And so Harvard Business School teamed up with Procter and Gamble. So globally looked at the impact of using generative AI in a team context,
Mhm.
see the difference it made. Because it's one thing to say, it's sexy and it's cool and all the features and the benefits and the rest, but what does it actually look like in terms of adding value and achieving efficiency? This was the first at scale study of this. What they found is that teams using AI were 12% more productive, more effective in their roles. They got more done. Interestingly, they enjoyed the process more. There was greater job satisfaction and engagement by using AI because it was taking away some of the drudgery of the work. The most telling stat, though, was this: one single human using AI was as effective as two humans who are not using AI. And
Wow.
so I think these are some of the things that over the coming while we're going to see this really take shape and impact so many organizations. My driving focus right now is how do we preserve the human stuff,
Yeah.
organizations in our roles, because really that's going to be where the conversation, the emphasis has got to be for a lot of leaders right now.
And yet, if you talk with lots of people in the workplace, they'll say they've never worked harder. They've
Yeah.
got these incredible tools and resources at their disposal now. And yet, productivity hasn't moved. It's been even slipped back a little bit for a while in Australia.
Yep.
Do you think that's due to a lag effect, or what do you think is contributing to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that could be affecting that. I think one of the things I'm seeing is that in a hybrid work environment, there are some great benefits. People can do school drop off and then
Mm.
go back home, do a day's work, not have to commute into the city or into a regional area, like the hub of that regional area. But the challenge of that, the flip side, the dark side of that is just knowing when to switch off and knowing how you work best in that environment. And some people work brilliantly when working on their own. I mean, my wife would be a good example of this. So she works one day a week in her 4 day a week role, one day a week from home, because that's when she does all of her deep thinking, all of her creative planning work. She is in the office. It is like open plan office nightmare,
Yeah.
constant interactions, constant noise, constant interruptions. So like for her, she's found a rhythm that's working for her, but I think a lot of people are still trying to find that rhythm. Real extroverts do struggle
Mhm.
working remotely. And even extroverts where you might spend all your day on calls like we are right now on a Zoom interface, it's not the same. And you don't have the same types of interactions, those interactions where you're not engaging around the same themes and topics. The threshold for starting a conversation is higher. Like if you're just walking someone past someone's desk and you notice they've got a moment, or you're chatting on the way to get a coffee, that idea exchange is organic and free. If you've got to set up a Zoom call to actually have that conversation, you're like, is it worth actually bothering setting up the call? I'll wait until I've got a few things I need to ask that person, and you miss those incremental things. So I think the impact on productivity from a hybrid or remote workplace standpoint is really significant. But I also just think you've got organizations where we're piling more people on, more tasks onto the capable people. And so the capable people are the ones who are feeling often overburdened. And hopefully, if we use these AI tools well, they'll take some of that burden away. I mean, we'll see. Hey, the reality is we were told years ago that technology, being we'd have all this free time, we managed to fill our time and fill our people back to capacity pretty fast. So I'm hoping that this doesn't just increase the velocity of work, but not the volume of work. That'd be my concern.
And in this rapid change, how do we preserve the humanness of the workplace? How do we, look at things that are important to us as individuals? We have these tools, but there's still very important things that humans have to do together, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, it's hard because it's different for every role. And so it's figuring out in your environment and in your role, what are the things that only you can do as a human? That, for instance, in my role and similarly in your role, a lot of what I can do in terms of preparing for what I deliver on the platform when I'm speaking at a conference, I can use AI brilliantly. I mean, AI has been a phenomenal research tool. I use it to help to craft content for articles, for social posts. I mean, I'm able to be much more productive in that way. AI can be a great tool. It can do a lot of that stuff quite well. What it can't do is get on site at a conference, get a feel for the room. And in that moment, like figure out who needs a bit of love, who needs a bit of attention, who do I need to really spend time with to make them feel comfortable. Because often you get there and the client's tense and hyper and they're nervous and they've never done this before. And I mean, I do it all the time. So I can sit with them and just, what can I do to make this easier? Or even just be more proactive. You get a gut feel for how things are. When the AV team, you can tell they're not very experienced. And like rather than just trusting them to do the AV stuff, I get behind there and I just check a few things. And that's gut feel, that's intuition. That's really, I guess, wisdom, if you want to put a word around it. I feel like we're moving from a knowledge economy to a wisdom economy. Like the real value, the premium now is in what you can do because of the experience you've got. And then those very human traits like intuition, judgment, deep empathy. That's the stuff that AI can't do. And so every
Yeah.
role function is looking at what are the things that I can do that a piece of tech can't, and realizing there are some things that technology will do far better than you. Outsource that stuff to free up your capacity, your headspace, your time, your energy to be able to engage as a human and do the human things.
Yeah, one thing that I often do when I do a keynote is use, a Mentimeter poll. And I ask people to reflect on a great team they've been part of, not an average team, but a great team that really stood out. And I have about 10 options they can choose from. I ask them to nominate three. And in 95% of the cases, the top three are that we had each other's back, we cared about each other, and we enjoyed working together.
Yeah.
And they're just also human elements, aren't they? We really have a fundamental need to be part of something, to feel that we belong.
Yep. Yeah. I'm finding that interestingly with young people, especially from a generational standpoint, the Gen Zs or Gen Zs, depending on where people are dialing in from, they're craving that connection, that sense of being together. Interestingly, the greatest appetite to be back in the office is from younger generations, not the older generational crew. And in
Mm.
some ways, even though you might think intuitively they're the tech natives, surely the technology would be super comfortable for them, and it is. But also because they're the tech natives, they've grown up with so much more of the digital. There is that innate craving for connection, to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, but also the mentoring that comes along with being with other people, that sense of apprenticeship in a role. You think back to your early 20s, so much of what made work rich and meaningful was the people you worked with.
Absolutely.
Drinks on a Friday night. It was like those small interactions you had throughout the day that might only feel like small talk, banter, simple things, but that actually makes you feel like you're part of a team and feel like you're valued.
Definitely.
practicing. And so I think for younger people, especially, like any generation, when you're in that younger formative stage of your career, those social bonds really matter for all sorts of reasons, professionally and personally. I mean, think of the number of people you know who, their partner or their spouse, they met at work or through a
And
common work friend at work drinks or whatever it was. That these are really key connection points at that stage of life. And so it doesn't surprise me in a way that they are hungry to come back to the workplace, because I feel like that's often what makes work meaningful. And I mean, to your point, that's one of the key metrics, that sense of feeling valued, being part of something.
when we work in a hybrid way where everyone's not in the same place, what's been some really great ways you've heard that teams do feel that sense of connection, care, and belonging? How can you do that when people are often working remotely at times?
Yeah, I think that firstly, it's about looking at the intentional times where you can be physically together. So if you're coming together, let's say make sure it's like a Tuesday. Every Tuesday we're together. Let's not fill that Tuesday together with meetings that could be done on Zoom or
Mm.
Teams. Let's fill that time with when you get to build that sense of social connection and cohesion. These are activities or times where you're physically together for the purpose of building commonality. And then leave the rest of the week to do other things that can be done much more transactionally. I think from a leadership standpoint, one of the big things leaders can do is let their guard down, be far
Mm.
more real. Also to
Mm.
over communicate. The reality is, if there's a gap in understanding, if we don't feel like we've been told something, or there's a question mark as to why this decision was made or what's happening here or who's doing what, if there's a gap in the absence of information, people will create their own narrative, their own story. And so we've seen that increasingly with remote and hybrid work, is often those gaps, because there's not over communication. The CEO or the leader will say, well, I put out a video message last Tuesday. They've all got that. It's like, well, but
Mm.
you need to say it like 2 and 3, 4, 5 times in different formats, because in remote working environments, there's so many more opportunities for that to fall through the cracks and to get missed. Because I think over communicating is really important. So again, otherwise people invent their own narrative.
One of the other points raised in that poll was that we have each other's back.
Yeah,
And this
wow.
is a sense of psychological safety. It's a sense of we, stick up for each other. And I read in a LinkedIn post that you'd recently read Amy Evanson's recent book, which I think is called The Right Kind of Wrong.
Correct. Yeah. Yep.
What was it that stood out from that you believe was really significant?
I mean, it's an excellent book and it covers a lot. Like, it's actually quite a diverse book, because most of us are familiar with Amy's early work, particularly in the healthcare space, around
Mm.
how to create that sense of psychological safety so people make mistakes, own up to them, and learn from them.
Yep.
This is really overlaid on top of that and looking at some of the things we are seeing that are causing people to shrink back from bringing them their full selves into the workplace. And again, the impact of digital technology putting that layer in play in between each of us as individuals, and how often that means that we're two-dimensional rather than bringing our full selves into the workplace. So there are a couple of chapters in the book that really jumped out to me that were about just how do we be far more intentionally vulnerable and honest with each
Mm.
other, and particularly from a leadership standpoint, how important that is. I mean, one of the great things we saw, especially in the early days of lockdown and COVID era, when everyone was working from home and trying to figure it all out, those wonderful moments where life broke in, like the cat walked in front of the camera, and it's like, and then sat down in front of the on your monitor or whatever. Like, and for the leader, they're like often terrified. This idea of, I'm going to be seen as not credible, not serious as a leader. But those are actually beautiful moments, because suddenly the leader was real. And so I think creating those opportunities where you can be unvarnished and honest and upfront, the importance of that creates an environment of not just psychological safety, but an environment where people feel they can be themselves and be real.
Yeah.
It's not this need to have a facade up about this is me at work and then me normally. And
Yeah.
part of that's reflected in what I've noticed in the last couple of years. Dress codes in the workplace have fundamentally changed.
Yeah.
Like, I've not seen a tie in the workplace for probably 6 years. I mean, every now and again you'll see some, but very, very rarely. I think there has been a sense of being much more casual and open, which I think, if you're looking for any silver linings from the whole COVID era, that'd be one of them.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I love that authenticity and vulnerability. It just really does increase a sense of connection with people when
Mm.
when they're not perfect, when they talk about what happened
Yeah.
in real terms.
Yeah.
When I had Amy on the podcast, one of the things she said was really interesting, and that was we should learn to lead like scientists. And what she meant by that was that we can never have all the information, or if we do strive to have all the information to make a decision, it'll be too late.
Yes,
And
yes.
so she talked about, as a scientist, you have a hypothesis. So based on the best background that you have, this is our hypothesis, and let's give it a shot. And we'll review it in 2 months, 3 months,
Yep.
see how we're going, and then reset if it's not in the right situation. And I also recall that the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, talks about the 70% rule that, you just can't have 100%. 70, let's give it a shot.
Yep.
Are you seeing people being more conscious about taking risks these days? Because there is just no way we can understand all the background, all the influences 100%.
Well, I'd like to say yes. I think the reality is there is still a natural reflex amongst a lot of leaders to look like they're in control, to look like they've got all the information, because we assume that extreme confidence equals total certainty. Extreme confidence or certainty equals credibility. And that's not
Mm.
always the case. Certainly in the leaders in the people you're leading, they're looking for you to be, again, as we talked about, real and honest and open-minded, not rigidly stuck to the way we've always done things because it's always worked. The tricky thing I'm finding is you've got other stakeholders involved. While your team may be keen for the leader to have a more collaborative, open-minded approach, not be so certain, but be more curious in their leadership style, be more of a scientist. If you're in a publicly listed company, there's often not that same grace extended. This idea of the answer being, we're not sure. To be comfortable with not knowing the answer to questions is going to be increasingly important for leaders, because any leader who says they've got all the information and all the answers to all the questions is either deluded or lying. The
Yeah.
problem is we do have a financial system that still rewards certainty. I mean, look what we've seen
Mm.
happen in the last few weeks and months with tariffs on and off again. And the market hates uncertainty. The market hates nuance. It
It
only
really
wants
does.
absolute certainty. This is
Yeah.
what's happening, and this is when it's going to happen. The
Yeah.
reality isn't like that. And so for leaders, there is this fine balance between being open, honest, vulnerable, being a scientist. The language I'm using right now is I'm working on a new book around some of these related themes, is the idea of being an explorer rather than an expert. Because an expert leads into what has worked, leads into power and authority, leads to this idea of having all the information, all the answers. An explorer is more interested in asking questions. You think about the classic modality of an explorer going into uncharted territory. And here in Australia, we've got some of the best examples of different exploration parties that would set off, and they didn't just go in completely open-minded and like, let's see what we find. They were planned, they were organized, they had experience, but once they set off, they had to have a level of humility. And I remember traveling around the center, around Uluru and some of those areas around the southern part of Northern Territory in the outback, proper Aussie outback, last year with my family, and we noticed a number of plaques in different cities where the plaque would talk about an exploration party that perished. And if you compare the ones that perished versus those that don't, the ones that found new areas, unlocked new parts of the countries, and returned back to the cities, it typically is because they had the humility, asked the locals for advice. They sought out the indigenous people who'd lived there for eons and said, how do we do this? How do we get water here? What's the food source we can trust? And so the experts that went out with that expert mindset, the arrogance, the hubris that often goes with that, because they've done this before, were the ones that paid a high price. The explorers, who were, again, highly experienced, very well planned, but were open to new inputs, new ideas, new perspectives. They were the ones that prevailed and did well. And I think there's something in that for leaders today. Is as much as we have expertise, having the posture or the archetype of being an expert, I think, is dangerous in this environment.
I also remember reading about that in Jim Collins' book, Great by Choice.
Right. Yep.
And he compared, Antarctic expeditions by Edmondson and
Yes. Yeah.
Scott. And, the difference in the preparation, the difference in reducing risks between the two were just extraordinary.
Wow.
And it led to, for example, Scott had these mechanized things that he took to the Antarctic, which basically froze up. The fuel froze, the engine froze.
Yep.
But Edmondson went with dogs, the huskies that could
Yep.
survive in that situation. On the trek out there, Scott would put just one lot of food to get coming back. Edmondson would put flags around the food for about a kilometre either way. So
Wow.
off track, you'd see the flag and know where to go. And I think that is, and I'm sure you've also read the extraordinary story about Shackleton as well.
Yeah.
Like, wow, even when they found themselves in unbelievable situations, which you just think, "What? I have no idea what I'd do."
Yeah.
He did manage to really save every person who was part of that ship. So there is definitely something in there. It's not by chance. There is really well prepared people, the right mindset and the right resources. And I love that, that quest for that new book, because explorers is the mindset we need. I see, you've done this, I think will be your 11th book. Is that right,
It
Mike?
will be. Yeah. Yeah. The next one.
I just want to jump back a little bit just before we move into talking more about your books, but back to your first. And as I understand, that was Memento. And this was a story that you wrote, and I know it came from personal experience,
Yeah.
about why you wrote it. Would you mind explaining to our listeners that background?
Yeah, so as it happens, Memento was book number two. So book
Oh,
number
all right.
one prior to that's fine. And so book number one prior to that was one called The New Rules of Engagement, which was all about, at the time, one of the early books on generational change. So boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, the millennials, how to engage that group. And so in many ways, the backstory to both of those books, number one and number two, are somewhat linked by the same story you're referring to. So I had done a bunch of research into generational change, mainly because I was seeing it play out every day. In my own context, I was in a software marketing and sales roles for a tech company. I could see these generational points of friction. And I thought this is really interesting. And all of the commentary at the time was from older generations trying to look at how younger generations could be connected with more effectively and how to lead them. But I'm like, well, I think we need a voice of the younger generation themselves. And as a young, I was only 21, 22. I'm like, I'm in the generation everyone's complaining about. And I feel like there's so much truth in what's being said. Like there is so many differences. How do we come together and learn from each other? And so to me, I saw there's a real opportunity to essentially work with younger generations to help them understand the older generation. So it was a two-way street. So I'd done a batch of research all about this stuff, came up with what I thought was going to be, and what in many ways became the first draft of that first book. And I gave it to my dad to read. So my dad was a careers advisor in a high school, government high school in Wollongong. Showed him this manuscript, and he said, this is really valuable. He said, if you could go into schools and help like your 10, 11, and 12 students with these sorts of insights to know that, this is how the world of work is going to be for them. This is, they're going to be working for older generations. Here's what they're thinking, how to play the game and succeed when you get into a world that is governed by baby boomers and Gen Xers. He said, that'd be really valuable. We get funding in schools to run programs like that. And so he, in fact, sent an email to one of his colleagues, who is the head of the Careers Advisors Association in New South Wales here. Her name was Lynn Camp. And he just made the intro for me to her and said, my son is doing this research. It'd be great for him to get some insights into what's happening in the careers advising world more broadly. And so 2 days later, and he was 51 at the time, no warning. He'd had a couple of sort of heart murmurs in the week leading up to this, but the doctor said, look, it's probably nothing, but we'll get it checked out, but don't take it too seriously, nothing to really be concerned about. And what we discovered later was there was an electrical issue with his heart that was undiagnosed. And so Monday morning, middle of October 2004, passed away. And that was it. And it was such a shock. And I remember after all of the, all the dust settling after that, and anyone who's been through that experience, especially a shock loss of someone who's young. So, they don't have all the things set up, like we didn't know where all the details were, because it's not like he was, there was a sense that this was coming. So we got our affairs in order. So it was just like a lot of chaos for the weeks that followed. Once all the dust settled, I remember having this email in my inbox from my dad to Lynn making this introduction. And I was still sort of grieving, trying to figure out which way it was up. But I thought, well, I've got this email. I owe it to him to follow this up. So I did. Organized to have a coffee with Lynn Camp, beautiful woman, super generous. And she basically just took me under her wing a little bit for the next few weeks and said, look, this is how it works. This is what careers advisors are looking for. She actually helped me put together the first brochure with a series of seminars to offer to schools. So essentially the stuff my dad would have helped me with. And then I was off and racing. And so I spent the next 3.5 years in high schools working with, at that point, Gen Ys mainly, a few Gen Zs, but mainly that group Gen Y or millennials, all around the sort of school to work transition readiness piece. And so much of it came from that sort of almost a sliding doors moment. Had that conversation with dad not happened, had he not sent the email, I mean, quite likely without the tragedy, Lynn may not have necessarily given me as much time and help and advice.
Mm.
All those little thin threads led to what I'm doing now. And so that was the first body of work, which then ended up leading to the book about generational change that came out after I'd done 3.5 years in the trenches, in schools, working with younger generations. The book you're referring to, Memento, is essentially a book designed to help parents write down their stories, to pass on their experiences, their wisdom, their memories to their kids. Because what we discovered shortly after dad passed away is in his desk drawer, there was a notebook filled with all these stories he'd been recording about his life, his childhood, stuff that we would never have otherwise known about. And so like that was such a special thing for us to have. We've still got it. I've got it on my shelf upstairs here. And so we decided to create a book that would guide parents through the process of doing that. And so both of those first two books were essentially as a result of that experience.
Yeah, and so you were around 21, is that
Yeah,
right?
I was 22 at the time. Yeah.
22, like
Yep.
very, very young. What do you think like, I can't believe how fantastic it would have been to find his writings and his
Yeah,
messages and his beliefs. That must have been really, really special.
it
What,
was.
what did you feel that you missed by him passing away so early?
A great question. I mean, I feel like in many ways I got what I needed. You know,
Mm.
as a young man, I think like I'd moved out of home, I'd finished university, I was in a career. I mean, there's always things I look back on. I mean, there would be numerous times, even the last 12 to 18 months, I'm like, I wish I could ask dad that.
Mm.
You know, and even just the process of becoming a parent and then a little one moving through different stages of life. I mean, parents are such a wonderful sounding board of like, what was I like at this age? And what would you suggest? And when I asked mum, but it's just that dad son, you know, that's a really special relationship for me to ask, you know, as I'm raising my own son, how to do the same sort of thing that he did and what his wisdom would be. So I do find that, I bet for me, I'd launched into life. I was grown up. The bigger thing for me was my younger siblings. So I had someone of 5 boys and I'm second oldest. So I had like a brother that was 16 or
Mm.
15, you know, like, and so too young, just far too young, and at a really vulnerable stage. So I felt more for them at the time because I'm like, at least I got into adult life and I'm launched into my career and life.
Yeah.
And it was the younger brothers that I felt, yeah, just really sad for. They missed a lot of those, particularly those really significant transition stages, you know, finishing high school, choosing careers, choosing further study, relationships, then marriage, like all of that stuff. Yeah, that would have been really lovely for them to have had him around for more of those years. So I feel
Yeah.
grateful that I got as much as I did.
Yeah. Both my parents were lucky to, enter the early 90s before they passed away. But one of the things that I did, and I heard about it through TED, I think, they
Yeah.
they financed something called StoryCorp. And
Yes. Yep.
and it's an app where, you interview parents. And I was very, very glad that I interviewed them both and preserved their stories on there. But I wished I'd interviewed them 3 times. I really
Yeah.
did, for, the grandkids to hear, some of their early experiences and setbacks
Yeah.
and, what led to a great life. And, it's wonderful it can be preserved and
Yeah.
passed on. It makes a big difference.
Yeah.
What do you do for your self-care, Michael? How do you stay in the green zone? How do you keep yourself optimistic, resourceful, energetic?
One of my rhythms that has been for a long time is journaling. So I would journal most days, I would say. So I think it's particularly when you live in the public eye a lot. I mean, my time is spent on stage, television, media stuff. Like it's had a prominent role. What I'm always very aware of is the gap between your public persona and your private world. The bigger that becomes, the more dangerous things
Mm.
become emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And so for me, having those daily rhythms where I spend time in obscurity where no one knows, and I've spent time just teasing out ideas and self-reflection and challenging myself. I mean, for me, prayer, reading sort of, scripture or things that are like rich in like traditional wisdom is really important. Because my world is all about the immediate, the urgent, the latest AI app. And it's so easy to get
Mm.
so absorbed in the new to the point where you become sort of untethered from what's timeless and those principles that will always matter. And so for me, I find those daily rhythms really important, just to, I guess, to keep that the ballast, it keeps me upright and keeps me stable in terms of my sense of self, my personality. I also am very careful to manage my energy when I travel.
Yeah.
I very rarely spend a lot of time at the social functions at conferences.
Mm.
So my least favorite environment is the networking thing where it's a loud room and
Lots
you're
of people.
shouting and you can't quite hear anyone. And my voice, whatever, for whatever reason, the range my voice operates at works great when I'm on stage or with a microphone. In that environment where there's lots of noise, it just doesn't cut through.
Yeah.
And I am shouting, and people are still like, "Sorry, I can't hear you." It's me. I will do the obligatory like minute or two, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Like I'll be there so I can be there to be seen because I want to, be around a little bit. But I exit stage left as soon as I can because I just know like it's the best metaphor is like keep your car switched off, but with every possible all the interior lights on, the headlights, the hazard lights, the battery will run flat really fast.
Yeah.
For me, that is the environment where all the headlights and every light is on. And if I stay in that environment too long, my batteries go flat really quickly. So it's managing my energy, I think, when I'm particularly traveling around. So it's some of those daily personal rhythms, but then it's also just as I'm in the flow of things, knowing where I can push in, push hard and push myself. And the times I'm like, this is just not a good fit for me, temperament wise, I'm out. And just being unashamed of that.
I love that. You also mentioned this journaling. Do you ask yourself specific questions, or is it more just what's happened today?
It's a bit of like what's happening. It's reflections, it's questions that I'm grappling with. A lot of gratitude, a lot of what I'm grateful for, or reflecting on this time versus say this time last year, trying to be aware of growth. Because it's amazing how, particularly if you're an A-type personality, it's always the next bigger, the next goal. And actually having those moments where you can flick back and go, my hope, prayer, wish, anticipation 12 months ago was for the very thing that is this now normal in my world, and not to miss that. I find that is a really useful way of just measuring progress and then being grateful, because otherwise it's very easy to just get restless for the next thing. And so I find that a big part of that daily process.
Yeah. And gratitude's such a great mood boost. Not that you deliberately do it for that, but there's lots of science that shows the benefit of just thinking about no matter what day you've had, what are three great things that have happened today, and actually recalling them. Actually, something that I do at the beginning of each day, and I learned about from Benjamin Franklin, to just write one question: what good am I going to do today?
Yeah, wow.
And just it makes you just think. You look at your diary, say, who am I going to come into interaction with? I'm going to see Michael. My goal is for him to feel that he's understood, when we do that. And other people, it's, to assist them. My son's looking at transferring from as a job as an anaesthetist in Cairns down to Sydney. And so I thought I'll do some research for him and do on AI to look at all the various elements that go through there. So yeah, those things can be very, very helpful, those regular reflections. And, something else that Mike Schneider, who I interviewed, who is the CEO of Bunnings, he judges his leadership or does it on what he calls the four H's. And that's honesty, humility, was helpful, and happy. And that's how he judges his day. We know how he goes that.
Right.
And I really love that. And I went on a very, very long walk once and I thought, what's going to be my version of that? And I ended up coming up with my 5 C's. And it's caring, it's centered, it's curious, it's constructive. And then the last one is chuckling like Dad. Because Dad always loved to chuckle. And I really love that about him. I said, how can I embody that going through there? So, identifying those things that are true to us is a very, very valuable self-reflection, isn't it?
I love that. I think, and even not just thinking for yourself, but for like in a family context, what are our family values?
Exactly.
One of the things that we've done over the years, and I try and keep this front of mind, is it's having adventures and making memories. And so we'll spend money and we'll spend time, we'll carve, capacity out of the calendar to do those things consistently. And like even this afternoon, so as soon as we finish, I'm going to race off and do school pickup. And this afternoon, we could just do a bit of homework and all the standard things. But I'm like, it's actually, we've got a break in the rain here in Sydney today. It's been raining for the last couple of days. Let's go for a bike ride. Let's do things that, like, in 12 months' time, our little boy will probably remember. And I'll remember. Like, we won't remember doing another afternoon of just tipping away at the homework. We'll do some homework when we get back. But, like, trying to make the most of every moment and not let the moments pass. And I think
Yeah.
probably something of losing Dad young has made
Mm.
me very sentimental. Like, every moment counts. Now, there's
Yeah.
that you can take that too far to the point where, you know, you're not happy to just be in the moment. It's almost trying to add meaning to everything. And there is a danger of that. I'm aware of that within myself. But I think what it does mean is that, like, I don't miss a chance to make a memory, to have an adventure. If it's there, we'll do it. And most of every day. So I feel like that is certainly one of our, those are our family values as well, which I think just really helps when you're deciding where you spend your time and your energy and your money.
I love that, planning adventures. And I do that with, my wife as well. The kids have left home now. But, one adventure we planned this year is to walk around Mont Blanc. And we're doing that in August.
Beautiful.
And the beauty about that is that you enjoy it all the way up to it. In fact, it's probably greater looking forward to it than actually doing it when it's really hard. But we specifically talk about that. We love doing adventures together. And life should be about that, doing things that, really resonate for you. We love the physical energy of doing that, but also staying in nice, comfortable places at night.
Yeah.
But yeah, my wife has a very busy career. She leads a group of about 40 researchers at Sydney Uni, has an unbelievably busy life, but on that trail, no fun. It's just magic for her. And
Great.
I really enjoy it as well. It's making things that really, touch your soul, as Pam Buchanan said, things that are really important like that.
That's great.
I want to jump back now to your work and your very important work. And one thing that I saw you shared on LinkedIn, which blew my mind, and it was the optimism or worry towards AI. And it listed 47 countries. India was top, 95% optimistic about AI, worried 55%. Australia came last out of 47 countries, and only 45% were optimistic versus India. What are we missing?
I think there's all sorts of things that could be a feature of this, so that drive this. I think Australia, in some ways, we're very innovative. In other ways, we're not. We're not because we're not forced to be as much as other nations are. You know, we are the lucky country. That idea of we've had such a good run economically for so many years because we keep digging stuff out of the ground, for instance, that makes us a lot of cash. So there is a level of comfort in Australia that I think can work to our detriment. It can make us complacent and therefore fearful of the new. I think there's also a real sense of egalitarianism in Australia that means any sense that big companies could control us, we flinch at. We're very, very aware or nervous about that. And so typically AI is big companies controlling so many of the things we're using in our schools. When you go into any classroom today, and typically they're using technology that has been fed to them, has been given to them by 4 or 5 large tech companies. And I think there is a sense of nervousness around the control that exerts in daily life. So I think probably the nervousness is around maybe a distrust or awareness of the power of big tech companies. I think that's part of it, but also just a level of complacency that's born of fear. Like, we like the way things are, and if it's too new, it's scary. Whereas you have other economies around the world that, I think they've caught up more rapidly to some of the things that we just take for granted now. I mean, you look in some parts of Africa, they've leapfrogged us in terms of their financial systems because they went from not having, for instance, not having landline phones to then going straight to smartphones and everything being done on their smartphones. Bank payments being done on smartphones, and they're so adaptive to change because they've leapfrogged us so quickly. There's often this sense of the legacy tech, the legacy way of doing things. It feels safe, it feels predictable, so we want to defend it at all costs, especially when there are players coming who wanted to do new things that perhaps there's a level of distrust towards. I think those are some of the factors that, to me, really play into this.
But I know you also speak a lot about disruption, and disruption is often complacency, not having what Andy Grove used to say, only the paranoid survive.
Yeah.
And I think there is that does occur, that we are complacent. We do have a very comfortable life, but it's a danger, isn't it? Like if we don't embrace the benefits of AI and see that it can help us to be a better country, better families, better individuals, we stand the chance of being disrupted as individuals, as teams, as a nation. And in your last book, Mindstuck, it was about helping to change minds. So if there is a visionary CEO out there that sees what's happening, that recognizes that Australia is being complacent, how would you recognize that they went about trying to change the minds of their managers, their leaders, their employees,
Yep.
to realize that we've got to be optimistic about this. We've got to, look at the things, the great things that can happen.
Yep.
What are your thoughts about the best way to do that?
I think the first thing is for leaders, the most effective way to frame this as something that people will be open to is to share your own experience, your own journey. And for most leaders I'm speaking to, even the most optimistic leaders about AI, they weren't always that way. And so leading with the, like, I get it. There was a time where I felt incredibly nervous, skeptical about this technology. What I learned was, and it's almost that classic sales technique of feel, felt, found. I know how you feel. I felt the same way. What I found is that. And that's the most effective way to validate someone else's position, share your own experience rather than facts and evidence and logic, put in the context of your lived experience or the experience of someone you know, and then what you learned in the process of changing your own mind. And so I think that's probably one of the most important things. The other thing is you want to figure out what are the fears that underpin that complacency. And interestingly, we tend to assume that humans are just intuitively, inherently afraid of change. We've heard that said for so many years. We assume it's true. It's not. Now, we're not afraid of change as humans. What we're afraid of is loss. The moment there's loss involved in change, that's when we dig our heels in, get resistance, switch off entirely, ignore the message or ignore the messenger. And so the losses we need to be most aware of, the loss of power, the loss of dignity, and the loss of certainty. An idea of something feels sure and certain, and if I change, I'm going into uncharted waters. I don't understand the new. And so that loss of certainty is what causes us to push back. And so if you look over history, some great ways that leaders have addressed those things. One of the most effective ones is to make change feel familiar. So frame it in a way that people go, oh, okay, I get that. That makes sense. And if this is just sort of an extension on what I've already done, something we've already experienced, they'll be far more open to it. So for instance, a good example of this would be like James Watt when he invented the steam turbine engine. It's very analogous to what we're seeing with AI right now. There was huge pushback, a lot of concern about these new machines coming in that would radically change society and upend industries and cause massive job losses. And of course, it did trigger the Industrial Revolution, and some of those very things happened. But the challenge in those early stages was to get people to be open to the idea of these new contraptions. And the genius move was for James Watt to describe the power of steam turbine engines in terms of horsepower. And that's why we still use that as our reference point. I mean, I hear about a new SpaceX rocket going into space, 300 million horsepower. What a
lot of horses
measuring power. And that's where it comes from. And so but when people can hear, okay, so this is 8 horsepower. I don't have 8 horses, I've got 2 horses. If this gives me the power of 8 horses, I can't afford 8. I'm open. I'm curious how this could work. And so I find, for instance, a conversation I had recently with someone who's an early years grad lawyer, was chatting recently, and she was a bit almost, I wouldn't say proud, that's not the right term, but she was sort of like, I don't use AI at all. She said, I'm nervous about AI, its ability to hallucinate. As a lawyer, I think it's really important. I spend the time, I do the reading, I go deep. I don't rely on AI. And it was almost that badge of honor for her. And I get it. And she's right. I mean, historically, particularly in the law world, lots of hallucinations. I mean, embarrassing moments of lawyers bringing precedents or cases to the bench that were actually fabricated because AI generated this legal precedent didn't exist, and so they'd skipped over all the discovery process in the research process for them. So AI, there are risks, but she was saying I don't use any of it because I don't want the risks. And I said, I get that. I said, the challenge is if you don't use some forms of AI, you're going to find yourself way behind your peers. and the
Yeah.
competitive marketplace. And you'll go for
Yeah.
jobs, and there'll be that sense of, if you don't understand this technology, you won't get the job, because it's one of those sort of essential skills. So the best way to think about this, and this is like using the James Watt horsepower type thing. How do I describe AI in a way that makes sense? I said, it's almost like someone who is so in love with using a typewriter, they didn't want to embrace word processing
Yeah.
because it feels like cheating. It's not the
Yeah.
right way. And because with typewriting, you have to be precise and thoughtful to undo something, to liquid paper it, to redo that page required energy and effort. So you worked really hard to be precise and specific in what you wrote. Word processing, copy and paste, delete whole sections. You could say that's lazy. And yet,
Yeah.
my goodness, what a more effective way to create content on a word processor. And I said, it's almost the same thing. And I said, if you're not
Yeah.
careful, it'd be like the lawyers 35 years ago who said, I'm not going to use a computer because I like my typewriter. That's the way things should be written up. It could be the same. And I could just see for her that was like a bit of a shift, which is like, okay, cool. I don't want to go all out with AI, but I need to be open to using it in some ways and developing some of those skills.
When I think of a leader who did an amazing job at turning around an organization, it's Satya Nadella at Microsoft.
Yeah.
And I saw his video of his first day presenting to a large audience. And he shared some real vulnerability about his children having learning difficulties
Yes. Yep.
and tapping into technology and AI to help them learn when they couldn't before. And so what he then did was to throw the challenge out to the excuse me, out to the audience and say, what problems do you want to solve? How can you use Microsoft to solve those problems?
Yeah.
So it's sowed in this deep sense of purpose that technology can be really helpful for things we want to solve. And I thought that was a great example of sharing vulnerability, but also a very personal story, but then throwing the challenge out to how can you use Microsoft to solve the problems that you're worried about? And I thought that
Yeah.
was
In fact,
fantastic.
I only read So Hit Refresh, which is his book about that whole process of
Yeah.
him sort of taking the reins. I only read that week before last. It's been on my reading list for a long time. It's just sat there.
Great book.
But I'm plowing through a whole pile of books at the moment in research for this next one, and it was on the list. And it was such a good book, so inspiring because of the level of humanity, the honesty. I mean, him describing that first meeting when he was sort of installed as CEO, he was interim CEO at the time, I think, and he got all the leadership team together, and they were so used to competition, every group competing with each other. And so, and he got the group together. And I think it was the Seattle Seahawks or whoever, one of the teams locally that had just had a really winning streak. And they got the psychologists who'd done the work with that team to come in and sit with the leadership team. And they spent, after the 3-day retreat, they spent the first day getting to know each other. These people have worked together for years, but they just, there was that sense of, we've got the professional and the personal. The personal was outside of it. And so there was that. And the other thing that really jumped out, and it goes to the theme we were mentioning before, as you said, one of his key mandates at Microsoft was to go from a know-it-all company to a learn-it-all company.
Love it.
And that sense of openness, again, explorer versus expert. They'd been the expert
Love
for
it.
so many years. Experts defend, explorers discover. And so
Yeah.
that distinction, I think, is so relevant for all of us. Like even for you and I, we've been in our worlds doing fairly high level elite stuff for years. How do we never get to the point where we think we've arrived? Where because we've had success doing something a certain way, we then defend that, we bed it in, we do it, and we try and preserve that. And that's the danger of any of us, and for any leader in the years ahead, is to realize the moment you think you've made it, you've passed it. We've never made it. We've never arrived. There's always the next thing to learn and to challenge our thinking with.
Fantastic. Been amazing catching up with you today, Michael. Enjoyed our chat so much and love how you keep your finger on the pulse of all these things happening. I will ask my final question first, but I'll just add about influence. And when I interviewed Steve Worrell, the local managing director of Australia, he'd heard about this organization in the UK that really wanted to bring mental health into the open in the workplace. And he had this idea of starting the Corporate Mental Health Alliance.
Right. Yep.
But he knew that it would take time, and he knew there was no money in it for him or Microsoft. But he asked Satya Nadella, this is what I'd like to do. Is that okay? And Satya Nadella said, why are you asking? Of course you should do it.
Wow.
And I've interviewed him and two other people that were in Microsoft during that transition, and the speed of change was unbelievable from being ultra competitive to embracing collaboration, embracing new ways of doing things. So yeah, I think we can learn a lot. So maybe everyone should make a note if you haven't read it to read that book because it is a wonderful way of getting people excited about
Yeah,
learning.
yeah, I agree. Love it.
The last question, Michael, is always knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
Oh, wow. I think it's probably the advice that I was given as an 18-year-old, and it was such helpful advice, and I kept it front of mind. I mean, along the way consistently, but it's proved to be so important for me, like playing a long game, really. And it's that idea of public victories always preceded by private ones.
Mm.
Pay the private prices like this. No one cheers when you go on to do training, but they cheer when you win the award at the end of the season. I think it's the
Yeah.
same with so many areas of life. I mean, like you, I live so much of my life in the public eye now. What people don't see is all the stuff, the accumulation of just doing things in obscurity, just being
Mm.
diligent, being disciplined, even when you don't feel like it. And I think so that was probably the best advice I got is that I think, and it was certainly the case when I was at that stage of life, 18, 19, 20. I mean, this was pre-social media, but there was that sense of everyone wanting to be in a hurry to make a name for themselves and be successful, become an influencer, even though it was a very early use term at the time. That is so much more the case now. Everyone wants
Mm.
instant success, huge number of
Mm.
followers. I mean, that idea of just being ordinary is essentially inexcusable today. Just idea of just having an ordinary life. Everyone's going to be amazing. And the problem with that is there's a sense it's got to happen fast. And if it doesn't happen fast, you're on the wrong track. And so that was the best advice I got at the time is just have the private victories, do the stuff that no one sees. And again, that notion, if it was easy, everyone would do it. And so like, if it's not easy, you're probably on the right track.
Yeah.
Persist, do the things people aren't seeing because the public victories will come if you're just diligent in the private ones. And so that was the best advice I got. And I'll probably go back and just underline that and highlight it because it really was the thing that kept me focused over the years. Because for a lot of years, it was just case of just gradually and slowly, sustainably building my business, research. I mean, it all happened slowly for me. It wasn't overnight. And I'm actually grateful in many ways that that's the case.
I love also, and this is a parallel to that, that I heard this Olympic athlete being interviewed, and he said, as an Olympic athlete, you only have to train twice. You have to train when you feel like it and when you don't feel like
Good. Yeah.
it. Yeah. Thank you so much for being part of the Caring CEO. Michael, it's been a real pleasure having you on.
My pleasure. Great to chat. Cheers.